For those of you who are married, here's an interesting question to ponder. Where did you meet your spouse? How did you meet your spouse? There's so many ways that happen right now, right? There's dating apps, of course. There's people meet at the gym. Statistically, 11% of people who get married meet at church. At least in the U.S. anyway. I think that's impressive. And there's a few of you who kind of meet at family reunions. I'm not judging here. Just the number who meet at a bar is actually relatively small, and probably good that it's a relatively small number. Now, it's interestingly, in the Bible, there's a surprising number of people who meet their spouse at a well. And it's like, wink, wink, hey, you want to meet up out at the well? I hear there's some cool stuff going down. I don't know what to say. Genesis 24, Isaac, the son of Abraham, meets his wife, Rebecca, at a well. Now, technically, it wasn't Abraham. He actually sent his servant to meet his wife at a well. But really, they met at a well. And then Genesis 29, Jacob, the son of Isaac, he heads on a road trip to meet a wife, and he stops by a well, and bingo bango, Rachel shows up to water her sheep. And they hit it off, and the courtship begins. Exodus chapter 2, Moses. He's escaped to Egypt, and he's living in the land of Midian. And as he's there, he comes across some Midian gals at a well who are being harassed by some other shepherds. And so he steps in and protects them. And then suddenly from that, he has a wife. Zipporah becomes his wife. The well is like really nothing fancy. It's about the most ordinary place that you could meet somebody. In fact, for the largest part of history, it was the most common place to meet anybody. If you want water, and everyone goes to the same well, and you want to meet someone, just go to the well and wait. They'll show up eventually. Hang around the well, and it'll eventually happen. So now, what you might ask, does this have to do with our theme today, where can I find real worship? Well, you're just going to have to follow along and figure it out yourself, so I'm not going to tell you now. But we're in a passage today that's full of surprises and profound truth and powerful symbols. It's John chapter 4, verses 1 through 42. Jesus is on his way to Galilee. Now, I'm not going to read all the verses of this. I'll kind of read spots, and then you can follow along in your phone, or in your Bible app, or in your Bibles. There's a few Bibles there for you as well. So in John chapter 1 through 42, chapter 4, verse 1 through 42, Jesus is on his way to Galilee. And in verse 4, it says, now he had to go through Samaria. Which, of course, when we read it, it just sounds like a matter of course. And if you look at the map, we would say, yeah, it kind of makes sense. He has to go through Samaria. But most Jews didn't go that way. Most Jews didn't go from Jerusalem to Galilee, both Jewish settlements, in a straight line. They would go around, cross Jordan River, come back across the Jordan River to get back into Galilee. They would avoid going through Samaria at any cost, because Samaria was hostile territory. The Jewish people and the Samaritan people were at odds about many things. The Jews considered them unclean. They were people who, the Samaritans were kind of half-breed people when the Assyrians had taken over northern Israel, and they took a lot of people back. And some of the ones that came back were these, what they called Samaritans. They were they had interbred with the Assyrians, intermingled with them, and adopted kind of some variations of religious things. So the Jews saw them as compromisers. And they looked down on them. And the Samaritans, not surprisingly, were not fond of the Jews because of their arrogance and their spiritual pride, right? And so Jesus' had to was not about the lack of options or even about what was normal. It was about a compelling reason. It was an appointment God's Spirit was arranging. It was a God-ordained meeting. And so in verse 5 through 7, they go into Samaria, and they stop at Jacob's well, where Jesus sits down tired and thirsty, and the disciples head into town to pick up some falafels to go. So now something interesting happens. Jesus is resting by the well, and a Samaritan woman comes up, and Jesus asks her for a drink. So let's read a few of these verses, starting at verse 7. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, will you give me a drink? His disciples had gone into town to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, you are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink? For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. And Jesus answered her, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. Sir, the woman said, you have nothing to draw well and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and his livestock? And Jesus answered, everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks the water that I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life. And the woman said to him, Sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water. Now, this is an amazing interaction. It kind of has images and, like I say, John uses, they say John always uses, kind of writes in simple Greek, but he doesn't write about simple concepts, does he? These are things it's like, wow, I'm trying to get our minds wrapped around. It starts out with a simple request for water in an unusual context, and the next thing you know, we're talking about water that you can drink and you will never be thirsty again. And it's an allusion to Jesus being God's gift. So I know some guys who consider themselves God's gift to women, but I don't think Jesus' bold claim here, it doesn't seem to be one that's diluted with ego or anything like that. And then Jesus continues in verse 16. Go call your husband and come back. I have no husband, she replied. Jesus said to her, you're right when you say you have no husband. The fact is, you've had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you have said is quite true. Sir, the woman replied, I see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshiped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem. Now, I think she's maybe feeling a little bit awkward that he's brought up some uncomfortable realities about her life. And most of us are pretty good at that. When an uncomfortable reality is brought up about our lives, we found a way to distract, to diffuse, to redirect, or something like that. And so she goes to, I see you're a prophet. And Jesus doesn't get lost in this potential argument, but he kind of comes around and he redirects it to the big picture. Woman, Jesus replied, believe me, a time is coming when we will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming and has now come when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship in spirit and in truth. The woman said, I know the Messiah, called Christ, is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us. And then Jesus declared, I, the one speaking to you, I am he. Like I said, there's so much going on here, but let's start off by talking about Jesus, tramps, and tragic stories. How many of you is this the first time hearing this story? That's what I thought. We're all kind of familiar. It's a well-known story because it's so dramatic. And often people just make some assumptions about this woman, that she's a loose woman with low morals. She's a tramp, right? That's what we think. She's had 5 husbands and she's lived with a guy she's not even married to. And there may be something to that, but there's also a strong possibility that there's more to the story. See, when we pull ancient stories into our modern world, we often miss significant realities. And one of those realities we miss in the first century is that women were not normally in the positions of power to initiate a divorce. So that wasn't something women could get divorced, but it was because their husbands divorced them, not because they initiated it. And so, technically speaking, we don't actually know this woman was divorced even once. She could have been a 5-time widow. We just know that she'd had 5 husbands, and the one she was living now with wasn't her husband. It could have been a combination of the above. Divorce, death, you know. People didn't live long lives in those days. There are so many things it could be. But what we do know is that often left a woman in a very vulnerable state of dependency. And as time goes on, probably less and less desirable to be married. So we know one thing for sure about this woman. She was deeply familiar with grief. She lost and lost and lost and lost, and then given up. The fact that she was with a man that she wasn't married to could have simply been an act of desperation. I have nowhere else to go. I have nowhere to turn for a meal. so I'll take what I can get. It could be this story is just more tragic than anything. I think this is where I started off talking about meeting your bride. I'm going to talk about this whole bride analogy. Does it make sense? Think about this for a second. That Jesus was waiting by the well to meet a bride. Now I know there's something inside of you is going, no. Jesus was not married. And I don't think he was looking for a wife. I know nothing about that in Scripture, that he's looking for a wife. And so your biblical accuracy meter just kind of going, like, well, wait a second, David, where are you going with this? Now, I want you to hear me out, though. John chapter 2. The first sign in Galilee takes place where? At a wedding. And the master goes and makes sure the bridegroom is there, and things are set up to make the things go just as the bridegroom wants. In John chapter 3, John the Baptist talks about his role with Jesus. He is preparing the way for the bridegroom, or groom is what we typically say now, which very much implies that there's going to be a bride, right? When you keep talking about a groom, you're looking around for a bride somewhere, right? Now, who is the bridegroom John is preparing the way for? It's Jesus. And who is the bride? It's a good question. So humor me for a minute on this idea that Jesus is going to Samaria because he has a divine appointment to meet this tragic woman, this sorry, sassy, sinful, on her grad weekend, she was voted most likely to get married again and again and again and again. She was not the gal anyone was looking to marry anymore, especially not by some Jewish rabbi. Jesus is not looking for a wife, especially not this kind of wife, right? Couldn't be. But then Jesus starts to show us his nature, the nature of God, who clearly reaches beyond the boundaries of racial, social, and gender. And he's talking to this woman. He's crossed as many barriers as you can imagine. And this is the one thing that we need to understand, that we need to know about Jesus, that there's no one outside the reach of God's love and God's grace. There is no one outside of that. There's no tragedy too deep. There's no grief so painful. There's no social barrier too high. There's no wall of tradition that's so wide that God's love cannot reach you, cannot reach me. And this is where the living water thing comes in. You see, there's nothing more common to humanity than the feeling of thirst, right? We all get it. On a hot summer day, it's like a cool glass of water. I remember driving the tractor on the farm when I was a kid, and we'd take like a gallon of, and we'd start off with ice in the morning, just a gallon of ice. And through the day, we would as the hot sun melted it, we would drink this cold water. And it was funny, we'd go through a whole day, and it was sometimes the whole gallon of water would be gone. Because you're just so thirsty. You needed that water. Our bodies crave it, we long for it. What's the phrase? Stay hydrated, right? Stay hydrated. As Layla said, water's a little bit good for you. When we're thirsty, it can be all-consuming, right? How many of you had to wake up in the middle of the night because you're thirsty? You just need to go get a drink of water. Thirst will wake us up at night, sometimes. Sometimes you're in a conversation, and it's a serious conversation, and you interrupt and say, excuse me, I just need to get something to drink. Because when we feel thirsty, it's like our body says, you need to take a drink now. Even as I was writing this passage, I had my glass of water sitting at my desk, I kept drinking more and more. I could, just even writing about it made me think, and you're probably sitting there looking up saying, I'd like to get one of those bottles of water right now. You can if you need to. And Jesus says, if you understood who you were talking to, you would be asking me for a drink, and I would give you living water, and you'd never be thirsty again. Now, the woman's sassy response is, oh yeah, give me that water. Well, I don't want to have to come back to this well again. That'd be great. I think there's a little sarcasm, maybe a lot of doubt, maybe with a dab of get real. I don't know, but Jesus isn't really talking about water, is he? See, Jesus takes this universal physical need we have for water, and he translates it into the universal spiritual need for our need for God. He's not talking about the physiological needs of our body. He's talking about the deep needs of our souls. And when our shame is translated to honor, when our chin is lifted up and we are seen as radiant, desirable, loved, we understand Jesus isn't talking about water. He's telling her that in his person is everything she needs to be spiritually whole and to be satisfied. Another husband isn't going to do it. Now, she isn't really picking up on what Jesus is saying, and then he kind of makes it personal. He starts talking about her life. He starts talking about her reality. You know, like, go get your husband. Knowing already that she doesn't have one. And now she's living with someone she's not married to. It. And then she understands suddenly this is spiritual. And so she says, I see you're a prophet. So she doesn't answer the question. She doesn't go into that. She doesn't unpack that with Jesus. She goes to something that's a little more safe. I see you're a prophet. And she changes the subject. And this is where we find that conversation about real worship. There's the title of our message, which with all the themes, you might be wondering, how do we just settle on that one for the theme? Well, we'll figure it out. I think this woman's almost using this conversation about prophet as a bit of a diversion. And we can talk more about my broken life, but let's not. You know, let's how about we talk about our religious difference? That's a serious conversation, but it's not quite so personal. It'd be safer. But here's the thing: there is no real safe conversation with Jesus. He answers her question with these inspiring words, verse 23 and 24. He doesn't completely ignore her question. He says, the time is coming, and now has come, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for they're the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship in spirit and in truth. See, here's the thing. Worship is so much bigger than a mountain or a building that we meet at. Because God is so much bigger than these things. You know, when Solomon built the temple for God, God says, as magnificent as this temple is, it's like a speck of dust to me. As big as these mountains are, they're like a molecule to me. How would you expect me to dwell in that? See, his spirit it is everywhere. And worship is only true worship when it encompasses everything. You know, he's spirit and he's everywhere and all the time. And when we meet him in truth and we give him our everywhere and our all the time, then we can say we have worshiped. When we give God our everywhere and our all the time, then we can say we have worshiped. And this worship is also specific. It comes back to the Christ, the Messiah, to when God intervened in history through his son Jesus Christ, that we might know his love for him. So it's also it's not just a random worship, it's very specific. You know, this woman, whose name we never know, deflects again. Because this is confusing stuff. And she says, I know the Messiah is coming, and he'll explain it all to us then. I said, I don't understand it, but somebody does, and it's not me. And while it may have been a deflection or attempt to end the conversation, what she said was actually true. What she didn't know was who she was talking to. And Jesus makes this declaration: I, the one you are talking to, I am he. Well, that's bold. It's very deliberate. And this is the first time that Jesus has made this declaration. And we get used to saying it all the time. But in the first century, this is the first time Jesus says it. And he said, who does he announce it to? A half-breed, marginalized, morally questionable woman. And then this is, here's the optimal time to make this announcement. You know, this is not the new iPhone announcement release kind of thing where they have a huge stage and broadcast it over the world. It's about, media-wise, about as bad a choice as you think you could ever make. And Jesus announces who he is. And she's overwhelmed with joy and light, and she runs to her town and brings back anyone who would listen. So look, here's the man who told me everything I ever did. Now, normally, when somebody tells us everything that we've ever done, we're like, I don't really want to spend any more time with you. You know, it's like that movie that came out in the late 90s, early 2000s, I Know What You Did Last Summer. The name of that is intended to be haunting. Because Nobody wants people to know what they did last summer, even if you have a pretty boring life. You usually have some things. You say, there's a few things that are okay, but there's a lot of things that are just for me to know. And here somebody says, here's a man who told me everything I ever did. Now the only exception with which you would go and announce to people that they would come follow you so that person could tell them everything they ever did, is if in the middle of this great vulnerability, you found and felt completely safe. You felt completely safe. And this is the reality of Jesus, the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. We have no secrets from him. But he gives us life, not death. He gives us honor, not shame. He gives us dignity, not embarrassment. And then Jesus tells his disciples, as the crowds come, says, open your eyes. The fields are ripe for harvest. This great evangelistic message of Christ, the promised one comes to ordinary places, to watering holes, and there he finds his bride. And for his bride, he takes the broken, the grieving, the disappointed, the sinners, and gives them refreshing, new, living water. It's a complicated passage, but there's a simple truth. Christ calls us to be his bride. He meets us in an ordinary place, and he takes us to an extraordinary place. He takes us into the heart of God. And there, together with God's church, God's bride, we worship. It's not about the music. It's not about the building. But it's being together, being his bride, and living for the one who knows us, loves us, and calls us his own.